Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Scotty Craig. I'll be your host today in the Learning Engineering Podcast. Joining me today is my co-host, Willoughby Seun Lee.
Thank you for joining us today. I'm one of your co-hosts today, Mei. I'm a PhD candidate in human system engineering working with Scotty at Arizona State University. And currently I'm working as a design intern at a University Design Institute at ASU. Today joining us is Fensie, and I'll let Anne introduce herself to you.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. So I am a lecturer at the University of Maine in Augusta. I teach computer applications and educational technology, and I am also a doctoral candidate at the University of Maine, where I am in the higher education leadership program. My research is focused on the science of adult learning in distance education. And I have fairly recently come to the world of learning engineering because it kind of put all my pieces together that I have encountered throughout my more years than I would like to count years in education. And I'm really excited to talk about learning engineering today.
That's great. Thank you for joining us today, Anne. And it's already clear, which is actually pretty clear with a lot of our guests, that you actually have a pretty interesting background as far as training and expertise within learning engineering and several potential relevant positions that you're working in. You've already mentioned a couple of them, but would you like to go into any more detail on specifically on what they are?
Sure, yeah. So believe it or not, I did my bachelor's was in music education. So I actually started as a musician, which I think really lends itself a lot to my kind of analytical engineering problem solving mindset. But I quickly moved into teacher professional development. I got my master's in instructional technology back in 2003 in the earlier years of the internet and online learning, where I was so excited about the power of technology to revolutionize education that I'm still kind of waiting to see some of I remember doing a project about the future of education, and I'm still waiting for some of those things to come true. I also worked in adult education for quite a number of years too, where I really learned a lot about how learning happens. I was a teacher, I was administrator. I've also been teaching at the college level for close to 20 years. I've also been an instructional designer for distance education. I've taken classes on and off for years, for my doctoral program, but also just for fun because I want to learn about cognition and educational psychology. So it was, I realized, though, that what I'm always trying to do is to make this thing of learning, this song of learning, better every time. And in this relationship with students where we're in this ensemble together, where we're playing together, I'm trying to understand them, they're trying to understand me, and we're trying to go someplace together. And I'm always looking around for clues that things are working or they're not working, and what can I tweak and try a little bit differently as I go through the teaching and learning process. And it was about 2 years ago that I went to a workshop at the International Conference of the Learning Sciences about how to bring applied learning science to your school. And it was Janet Kolodner, Aaron Kessler, a number of people in the iSchool community that were presenting about learning engineering. And my jaw was dropping to the floor because I'm like, what is this learning engineering? This is exactly all the pieces I've been trying to figure out how to tie together. And it was the clouds parted and sunbeams came down. And, so I was so excited to see that someone had written out on paper all these things that had been floating around in my mind and that I had been trying to do in the classroom. So I got involved in the iSchool community. I started going to meetings. I helped plan the conference last year, and then, went to the conference at MIT last summer, and, have been involved in like the higher ed MIG, and dabbling in some learning engineering myself. So I'm relatively new to the field of learning engineering, which itself is relatively new. So really only 2 years, but it's been a long time coming. There have been a lot of things in my professional career that really have brought me here. And even in my personal life, I have children with disabilities. And when my oldest has autism, and we learned about ABA, Applied Behavioral Analysis, which is all about data and using that data to inform how you're going to do interventions with them. And I, learned so much from that I bring into the classroom as well. So all of these things kind of led me to learning engineering.
Yeah, and that's actually pretty amazing. And you just said, you'd only been in, here doing learning engineering for about 2 years. But I would almost want to argue that maybe you've actually been doing it for, you said been doing this for 20 years. And I think I agree. And I think that you have been almost doing learning engineering for the whole 20 years based on what you've been saying.
Yeah.
I mean, from that early instructional design work and training to teaching and trying to figure out how to apply it and apply good learning strategies to improve that. That is kind of bread and butter where, rubber hits the road, kind of, to use that analogy, of where learning engineering starts to make impact.
Exactly. And I think there's a lot of people out there that are doing learning engineering and don't know it. There's a lot of instructional designers who are like, oh, I really like this learning sciences thing, how the mind and learning works. And I also kind of like this data thing. And, but that no one has put the pieces together for them yet. So I'm really excited about things like this podcast, where we can tell our stories about learning engineering.
Yes, and it's so true. I agree. I think that a lot of people out there that are doing learning engineering, and they haven't had that cloud parting experience that, you have been doing this for so long. And I would love to hear more about your perspectives, on doing this, learning engineering and applying learning engineering. Before we move on to that, I want a quick question about your kind of training and expertise follow-up. What are your current positions exactly?
Yep. So I am a lecturer at the University of Maine at Augusta. Okay. And my primary role right now is as a doctoral candidate. So I'm only teaching a couple of classes. So I'm not otherwise working full-time. I'm really student full-time.
That's a lot to handle, both teaching, even teaching part-time and student full-time that is a lot to have to deal with.
Yeah.
And what are you kind of focusing on? What is your program?
The program that I'm in at the University of Maine is a higher education leadership program, but we all really choose our own focus. So I've really focused in on the science of adult learning and distance education, which really isn't a field yet. So there is a big adult learning field. Mm-hmm. There is a big distance education field. Yes. But we haven't quite gotten to the intersection yet of really looking at the learning processes, what's actually happening in the mind of the learner while they're learning online. And it's interesting. I've been working with quite a large team of researchers over the last 2 years on doing a scoping review of the literature on adult learning processes in distance education. And we started out with over 20,000 records. We're down to about 150 that met our criteria that they actually studied adults. And we're saying average age 24 and above. So not legal adults, 18, but people who have life experience, people who have gone through some of the developmental changes that happen in the early 20s that start to affect cognition. And in addition to studying adults, there has to be distance education of some kind. So some transactional distance between the teacher and the learner in a formal learning environment with, a planned curriculum and some sort of accredited body that's delivering the education. The learning has to be described and the learning has to be measured. And the measured thing is not happening. Mm-hmm. And that is where I think learning engineering can really step in and help us figure out, well, how do we instrument in our online courses or in our hybrid courses so that we can actually get a better sense of how adults are learning, not just their perceptions of learning or their satisfaction, which are both important, but actual learning outcomes.
No, and that is so true. It's very difficult to find good learning outcomes and good learning measurements a lot of times. Yep. It can be difficult. And that is something that I'm like, really want to dig into more with you. Yep. That could be actually a couple other episodes of a podcast yes. right there. You're right. I mean, that area does need a lot of research. It really does.
And I will also say another thing about my background that kind of led me in this direction was that I did my master's at Bridgewater State College, which is now Bridgewater State University. And it was a teacher's college. And in the year 2000, their program was hybrid. And it was one of only about 20 programs in the country that were hybrid. So we met in person on campus the first class and the last class, and the rest of it was online in WebCT. And that was quite an experience. And I was actually studying that experience while I was experiencing it. And I used a lot of what I learned through that experience in my own work as an educator going forward. And, I really attribute a lot of, how I approach things kind of analytically and looking to see efficacy. I credit a lot of that to my studies at Bridgewater.
That's great. So anything else that you would like to talk about as far as your journey goes to getting from your initial training to learning engineering where you are now? Anything else about that journey that you would like to add?
Yeah, I mean, my children have really taught me a lot. And I think any parent kind of figures this out, that they're like, wow, my kid is figuring this thing out, or how'd they learn that? Or, oh my gosh, they picked this thing up that I do and I didn't mean for them to learn that. They were learning through observation, not like me actually teaching them something. So, any parent kind of figures out, some new ideas about learning when they have children, but having children with disabilities really exploded that in my mind about how do minds work and how does learning happen? And I can't make assumptions about it. You've heard of the curse of expertise, that oftentimes you know something so well that you forget the little pieces to teach along the way. And that's something that I have learned how to combat through my children about doing task analysis, that you really have to break down everything into individual component parts. And yes, for students who have a lot of that background knowledge, they can kind of quickly move through some of those. But the students that are missing some of that information, they really need those individual steps and like part task practice and things like that. So a lot of those things about the learning sciences, I actually learned as a mother of children with special needs.
That's pretty amazing. Yeah, and it's so true that like it is hard, especially as you get more towards the expert phase where you really know something. It is so hard to break that down and to remind yourself to do it. That's a very interesting way. I've never heard of anybody learning it. But I guess it makes sense. Like when you're having to teach kids.
Yes, yes. And like for one example, my son was 5 years old and he couldn't put his shoes on by himself. And it was so frustrating getting out of the house every day. And then we learned about backwards chaining, where we did all of the steps. We made, picture cards of each step of like, open the flaps and put your foot in and, all of these things. And then we do all of those steps as we announce it to him. And then we let him do the last step so he feels accomplished. And then the next time we do it, he does the last two steps, and then gradually working backwards until they are, he is competent with the whole thing. And that's something I bring into my teaching too. I start with partially worked problems and then let the students finish them so that they have a sense of success, but they've also got that scaffold there too.
Yeah.
So, yeah, a lot of these things I've learned from my kids.
Yeah, and it's a nice example of kind of the modeling, scaffolding, fading approach
Yeah.
that we know so well from cognitive science and learning sciences. Now you've actually already talked about learning engineering projects and things you worked on, but is there one project that you want to talk more about?
Sure. So yeah, so I was doing some learning engineering without realizing I was doing it. But I went to the International Conferences of Learning Sciences in Montreal this year, and I presented on some work that I did in the classroom because I'm interested at learning engineering at the small scale. Like what can be done in an individual classroom or with a tutor and a student. So a lot of learning engineering really looks at scaling things up and looking at the big scale. So I'm kind of interested in what happens at the small scale and how, what works in that process at both scales and what really works only, either at a large or a small scale. So I gave an example of self-regulated learning. One of the classes that I teach is a introduction to computer applications. And the school I teach at is predominantly non-traditional learners. And most of them have not been in a classroom for many years. Some of them had negative past experiences. Almost all of them worked full-time and they were going to school part-time. A lot of them, this was their very first college class. So they were just getting acquainted with college, and a lot of them were also older and had very limited technology skills. So their first class is a computer class, which they're already overwhelmed with. So there was a lot of emotion, that I had to deal with the students and getting them comfortable with actually learning, but then also learning a lot of the basic, how do I learn things that they'll need to know as a college student. And what I realized pretty quickly is that they were often lacking in self-regulated learning skills. And that was something that I had been doing some research about. And I took Pintrick's model of self-regulated learning, where he's got the 4 phases, the planning, the monitoring, controlling, and reflection. And then he's got it in the 4 areas. So cognition, behavior, affect, and context, environment. So I created a little chart with questions in each of those boxes about if I am controlling in the cognitive area, I might ask myself, what am I doing to block out distractions right now? And, I gave those questions to the students to have them ask themselves as they were working through the coursework. And then I also wanted them to actually answer the reflection questions for me so that I would get that information. So I made a Google Doc for each student, shared it with them privately, so only they and I have it. And I told them less than 5 minutes of writing. I want you to answer the 4 questions about what you learned or where you're confused, how you feel about your learning experiences this week or why you want to learn about this. What did you do that was helpful or what should you do differently? And then what was helpful about the structure of the class or the way that you interacted with other people. And I got amazing data from that. So I learned so much about my students and what their needs were. They also gave me great ideas about things that I could do in class that would be beneficial for them. So, for example, I gave them a task list of if I was taking the class, this is what I would do over the course of the week in this class. And I listed out the things that are not graded assignments. So actually reading the steps out loud, that's not graded. So most students, they're looking for ways to cut corners. They're only going to do the things that are graded. And they're not going to do a lot of the things that faculty expect that they're doing, like taking notes on their reading and things like that. So I listed it all out for them. And then a student said, I really actually would kind of like to see that in some sort of visual like calendar, instead of a long list. I'm having a hard time figuring out where would I fit all this in. So I did. I made a visual calendar and like kind of color coded things so that it's like the things that get graded or highlighted. And then the next week in the exit tickets, like half the class was like, oh, wow, I love that calendar. That was so cool. That helped me really plan out my week better. And so now I have these exit tickets. I do them in all of my classes because I get so much data ongoing and I'm able to adapt what I'm doing in the class each week. And when I was working as a faculty instructional designer, I also worked with a lot of faculty to do different types of exit tickets too, so that some of them would do it in like a Google form and just have a couple of questions that they could pull up in a chart format. You know, some of them would do it more about the content of what the students were learning, but they were so excited about getting that data in front of them, meaningful data that actually help them figure out what they're going to do differently next week. So that was one of the examples that I talked about in the short paper that I did about some of the small learning engineering that I'm doing in the classroom.
Yes, I'm loving hearing this because it's so cool. Like the learning engineering is a process, right? We have the challenge, identified it. I'm feeling like I'm so excited because the reason you conduct these courses is you identify a challenge, which you have a diverse class of students, and they have different purposes, and how you're going to conduct this class effectively. And then you have that, and then you form a team, which is a team is you and your students. You are having a co-designing session with these classes. That's amazing.
Yes, and it's qualitative data, which we don't often see in a lot of learning engineering and in a lot of educational research. And I think that's something that teachers have developed pretty quickly in the classroom. After being just a year or two in the classroom, they pretty quickly get a sense of how their students are doing. They learn some of those qualitative signals, but they don't necessarily know how to systematically collect that and analyze that. And so, you know, the exit tickets is like the best, easiest, low-hanging fruit that any instructor can do. And even if you have a large class, so like I worked with one teacher who had 120 students, and I was telling her about what I did. She's like, I can't read through 120 of those every week. I said, of course you can't. So instead, we created a Google form. She was teaching a math class, and she wanted to know, like, which students were really understanding this concept and which were not. So she would put in like some partially worked examples, and she would say, what's the next step? You know, where she knew that students often got confused, so that she could quickly pull up a chart at the end of the week and see, okay, this group of students are, you know, really need a little bit more instruction with this. And she would have some open-ended responses if anyone wanted to put anything in there. And, you know, most people didn't, but sometimes if they had something important to say, they put it in that box, and they were so happy that their teacher listened to them. So these were students at a distance that never met this teacher in person, but they felt connected to her.
Yeah, and that's a great way to build in presence into the
Yes.
room. So it's presence, both the teacher presence and student presence in the classroom, and that's an amazing example of how to implement that. Thank you for that example of, you know, kind of how we can do this at this small classroom basis.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember the term that you used because it was really great. It was about learning, is it small learning engineering or something like that? What was the term?
You know, micro learning engineering,
Yeah.
you know, at a small scale, you know, where you're a team of one, or like Maymay said, your team is you and your students.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, in the learning engineering toolkit, they talk about the team and all of the people involved in learning engineering. Well, if you're a teacher, you don't have a team necessarily, but hey, you do have the Office of Institutional Research that could help you with some data collection. Or if you had exams, they could help you figure out, well, what can I do with that data? What kind of analysis can I do? And you've got a teaching and learning center that you can go to. If you're a K through 12 teacher, you have a tech director, you have a curriculum director. You know, you do have people that you can pull into your team because you can't do this on your own. You know, you do need to talk these things through with other people. So whether it's other professionals or it's your own students.
Yeah, no, and that's great because I mean sometimes you do have to find your team. going to use that to transition us over to talk about lessons learned. Any other lessons learned that you may have? So either from, projects, this specific class project you're talking about, or from other projects, other examples throughout your career.
Sure. So one of my favorite conferences is Learning in the Brain. They have a conference in Boston, in San Francisco, and New York City every year. And one year I was there and I learned about interleaving. And I was like, well, that sounds really interesting. That, yeah, if it makes so much more sense that instead of learning a whole bunch of stuff in one area, then moving on to learn a whole bunch of stuff in another area, then moving on, you've forgotten the other stuff. And if you mix them all up, you start to see the patterns everywhere, and you start to, it like coalesces more in your mind. So I thought, wow, I should be doing interleaving. I thought about, okay, the computer applications class I was teaching, we used a textbook. It had 3 modules of Microsoft Word, 3 of Excel, 3 of PowerPoint, 3 of Access. And I thought, hey, what if I just did 1 Word, 1 PowerPoint, 1 Excel, 1 Word, 1 PowerPoint, 1 Excel, mix them up like that. And I didn't really explain it to the students very well. I forgot about who was my partner there, and I forgot about that human-centered piece. And when the next semester I explained it to the students, I explained what the purpose of that was and why we skip around in the book like that. And they were so appreciative of it, because they were saying, oh my gosh, by the time, a lot of times in my other classes, I get to the final exam and I don't remember what we covered at the beginning of the semester. But here we're revisiting it every week, or every other week. So I really feel like I know the material. So getting the learner on board with what I'm doing and being transparent about what I'm doing, I found that was a really important lesson to learn. And now I explain why I do everything. I tell my students too, I'm not going to ask you to do anything unless I tell you why you should be doing it. And if I don't tell you why, don't do it, or ask me. Ask me why I assigned something, because I don't want to waste your time. I work with non-traditional learners. They don't have a lot of time. So I don't want to give them busy work or things that I think are interesting. I will post those as optional things if they are curious and want to learn more. But I want to really make every single activity I assign, I want it to be meaningful. And for it to be meaningful, they have to understand the meaning. They have to know why I am assigning them to do that activity.
That's great. Just and really important too. And that's one thing I've had to learn also, that explaining things to students as far as like why am I doing this. And it's kind of like a level of like meta teaching.
Yeah.
And when you do that, just like metacognition, that meta teaching is actually really useful for students also.
Yes.
Same as, when you're talking about like that, the interleaving.
Oh, interleaving.
Interleaving,
yep.
Yeah, that's it. Interleaving content throughout the class is actually another wonderful example. It's like you're basically forcing students to kind of focus on those higher level Gestalt patterns as you move through, and that always helps people to understand it better. Is there anything else that you would like to kind of add or to promote here at the end? I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, I like this small scale of learning engineering and figuring out, how to make this happen and how to do it in less formal ways too, without having to have like a planning document and all these things. So I'm looking for other faculty who teach in distance education. We're planning to do, I've got a couple of colleagues, we're planning to do some learning engineering projects in our own classes this fall and collect data on that, and then hopefully publish something to share with other faculty about how you can use this learning engineering approach in your classroom.
Oh, that's amazing. Now, I can't actually let you escape and without asking you about this, because you have your own podcast.
Well, it's not my own.
Okay.
It's through the Learner Engagement Division at AECT, and it is such a joy to do that podcast. It's learnerengagement.podbean.com. We're on the Podbean platform. And we've had so many amazing guests. We had Jim Goodall to talk about learning engineering and about the toolkit. We had Paul Kirshner talking about learning sciences. We had Eric Mazur talking about peer learning. I mean, we've had some really amazing guests on there. So we're always looking for people to kind of talk about what they're passionate about getting engaged with learners.
Because I think a lot of our listeners would love it.
Great.
I'm excited to find out about it, actually. So,
yeah.
Anne,
yeah.
thank you so much for being with us today. This has been a wonderful conversation.